The human spirit, when all is in harmony, finds its natural state in peace and freedom, a spinning top dancing. Moments of love and joy resonate with ancient truths, respect for the divine, for family, the heart's call to do unto others as we would have done to us. This is the promise of humanity, to ease suffering, to honor the human condition, to live with hope and meaning in every breath. Yet shadows fall across this light. There are people in our world robbed of their freedoms, their very lives stolen, and this film shines a voice for the voiceless, calling us to stand for justice and to awaken and to act.
The year 2006 threw a curveball at me when I was surprised by a breaking news in the Epoch Times. I learned that in China, the wife of a surgeon, she was reporting that her husband, a neurosurgeon, actually confessed to her that he took the corneas of 2,000 Falun Gong practitioners in a Chinese hospital. And that was something I've never imagined this was even possible. Two investigators from Canada, David Kilgo and David Mathers, were actually conducting an investigation into this topic. They called the hospitals in China, pretending that they are patients. They wanted to find out if they can have healthy organs from Falun Gong practitioners. And in 14 cases, the hospitals, the doctors on the other side of the telephone basically admitted that they have only these fresh organs from Falun Gong practitioners. And that was something I have to say I would never have imagined. In July 2006, I attended the World Transplant Congress in Boston, and I talked to two doctors from China. The first one said they did 2,000 liver transplants in the year prior, and that was an astonishing number. And I was surprised, where do those organs come from for these transplantations, since China didn't have an organ donation program. Then I found another doctor and asked where the organs come from. And he told me that the organs are coming from Falun Gong practitioners.
So Falun Gong, which is a spiritual Buddhist school practice rooted in truth, compassion, and tolerance, with 5 Qigong meditative exercises, was first made public after thousands of years of antiquity in the early 1990s, in 1992.
After I had this conversation with these two Chinese doctors, I decided I have to do something. And I wondered, what can I do? I'm just a single voice, just a doctor with English just being a second language. What can I do? And then I realized we should actually have a medical organization that looks into it. So I decided that it should be me who start this organization. And this is how our organization, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, came to life. In the beginning, we realized that this is not the regular type of commercial organ trafficking, where kidneys are being sold for money on a mutual agreement. But here in this case, people were killed for the organs. And there was no term at that time in 2006 that would even describe this type of atrocity. So we came up with a new term that is forced organ harvesting. And that means that people are being killed to harvest their organs, of course, without consent. Nobody would consent to be killed for their organs. Forced organ harvesting is probably the biggest violation of ethical standards and even legal standards in the world in this century.
I'm Professor Lavee, Jacob Lavee. I'm the director of the Heart Transplantation Unit
here at the Sheba Medical Center, which is affiliated to Lavee University School of Medicine. I'm also the president of the Israel Transplantation Society and the chairman of the Heart and Lung Transplantation Committee of the Israel National Transplant Center.
I'm a geriatrician, so I specialize in the care of older adults, and I really went into medicine because my grandmother suffered some very serious medical issues that weren't really taken care of well by the medical system at that time. So I actually went into medicine to try and advance the field of geriatric care.
My name is Weldon Gilcrease. I'm a medical oncologist. I'm a cancer specialist at a large university academic practice with a specific focus in liver cancer. One of the primary reasons for my being interested in medicine was the use of science for the betterment of humanity.
My name is Charl Els. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and I work in private practice. I'm also on academic faculty. I'm involved at the John Dossetor Health Ethics Center at the University of Alberta.
My name is Harold King. I'm a retired dental surgeon. I was shocked to discover that the Chinese government initiated the extermination of Falun Gong practitioners using surgeons and hospitals. I immediately sent an email to Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and since the end of 2007, my wife and I joined DAFO and have never stopped working to end forced organ harvesting.
I have been an IT expert for a long time at a basic research institution in Germany, and I worked 10 years in a university hospital. I'm not a Falun Gong practitioner. I am also not a doctor, so I can't speak freely what I think about the attitudes of some Western and, of course, Chinese doctors. I do this pro bono because I think a crime against humanity has to be denounced publicly. And you know, I am a German and I know what happened in Germany. And a big problem was not only Hitler, a big problem was also that the German populations, also German doctors, didn't refuse to participate in these crimes against humanity.
What brought me into this whole issue of the organ transplantation in China was a patient of mine back in 2005 who waited for almost a year in my department for a heart transplantation. He was on the top of the Israeli list of candidates for organ transplantation. And one day he came to me and told me, Professor Lavee, I was told by my insurance company that I should go into China and to undergo heart transplantation in China. And they told me that I should go in a certain particular date 2 weeks ahead of time. And I looked at him and asked him, how come they can schedule a heart transplantation 2 weeks ahead of time? You know that somebody has to die on that particular day in order to make his heart available for you as a donor. And he said, I didn't ask. And the patient went into China and got his heart exactly on the date that he was promised 2 weeks ahead of time. So that has made me start looking into what's going on in China and to find out, to my horror, the law that has been enacted in China already back in 1984, which enables and permits the use of organs from executed prisoners for the purpose of organ transplantation.
I've been a transplant surgeon for almost 18 years and at some pretty busy transplant centers. I had a patient who needed a liver transplant, but his cancer was far too advanced to allow him to be placed on the list in the United States. And he was not placed on the list in the US, and he went to China to receive a liver transplant. And he received one very quickly. And he came back to the United States, and in a few months he came to me again. And he said, I had a transplant there, the liver has gone bad, and my cancer has come back. Can you transplant me now? And I said, no, I can't transplant you now. The reason that your cancer came back is because you were at too high a risk of cancer. You shouldn't have been transplanted. And in fact, when you transplant a person in that situation, it makes the situation worse because now they're on immunosuppression that lowers their immune system, and the cancer cells can progress more rapidly because now your own body doesn't even fight the tumor.
This was puzzling to most people that were hearing this. How can you schedule a transplant in advance? How can you schedule a transplant in 2 weeks? that has to mean somebody is being murdered essentially for the organ that you're going to receive. And so you saw on-demand payment for organ transplants that were occurring within China. You saw this enormous uptick of transplant activity that was occurring within China. And you essentially have websites as well that were advertising online, come to China, pay X amount of dollars for whichever organ, $60,000 for a kidney, $120,000 for a liver, $150,000 for a heart, and we will get you a transplant. They would advertise that their average waiting time for something like a liver was 3 to 4 weeks. And to go back and put it into context, this is at a time when there was no organ donation or distribution system.
With the current knowledge of transplant surgeon how to preserve organs from donated people, we can preserve organs from, as far as heart are concerned, for as short as only 4 to 5 hours most, and with kidneys up to 12 hours. So this means that every organ donor needs to die on the very same day that organ transplantation is taking place. So the only way such an operation can be promised ahead of time to any potential candidate is if the surgeon knows for fact that his potential donor, so to speak, if you can call it a donor, will die on the day of the scheduled operation.
When I read Matas and Trey's book on state of the organ, that opened my eyes. And when I saw the videos of people giving testimonies of what was going on in terms of the prisoners of conscience, which were initially accepted as icons in society, to lead a clean life, to then be imprisoned for their beliefs, becomes the most revealing to me. But what's even more revealing is what happens to them when they've done nothing criminally wrong.
I was actually just walking through Sydney and saw a poster for a flyer of a talk by David Matas, who was giving a breakfast seminar, and I had never heard of organ harvesting in China until that point. I was actually astounded by what I heard at the seminar. I didn't believe that in this modern day and age that medical doctors could be actually acting in such an unethical way. And it really motivated me to find out more about it and seek out organizations. And that's where I found Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, which I joined soon thereafter.
My initial interest in forced organ harvesting was actually one of wanting to show that it wasn't happening. But then when you spend enough time with the evidence and the data, which is the major driver for most people that are in medicine, you quickly become aware that this is a problem of enormous scope, that innocent people and innocent lives were being taken in China for profit and to try to extinguish specific populations within China.
Well, I was the European Parliament Vice President for Democracy and Human Rights, and I was also the European Parliament spokesman on that subject, and I was writing a report in 2006 for the European Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee on democracy worldwide and human rights. When I visited Beijing in May 2006, it was to investigate reports of the persecution of Falun Gong, which had been taking place since 1999, and in particular, the forced organ harvesting from live prisoners. And I didn't believe at the time that this could possibly take place in a modern country, but if it did, it would constitute genocide under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention.
Needless to say, when you hear a vivid and chilling story like this, it almost seems horrific to believe. But when I looked at the evidence, the report that came out by Matas and Kilgore, and in my conversations with Mr. Kilgore, I've certainly come to know the evidence better, and certainly it's beyond a shadow of doubt in my mind that this is what's happening to this day in the People's Republic of China.
When I first heard about this, my first reaction was, this is impossible. Doctors don't do this. I couldn't believe this. And it took me a long time and a lot of investigations until I was really convinced this happens from the abundance of evidence. The problem is there is a little bit too much evidence. A normal person has not the time to read those hundreds of pages of evidence. And so they simply don't believe it. Another reason is that the Chinese government always says Falun Gong is a malicious sect. It's they do bad things in China. And so people in Western countries don't know much about life in China, so most of them don't know Falun Gong practitioners by their own experience. So they simply believe, oh, this is such an obscure sect. And I think that's really dangerous. This reminds me a lot of what happened in Germany. The Jews, in this time, the Jews were some kind of a strange religion, and nobody cared much what happened to them. And this happens again now with Falun Gong believers. I think we should really think about this.
The topic of forced organ harvesting is so unusual for us in our civilized society that we often cannot comprehend it, and we also don't know how to handle the evidence. There's a historic example where a Polish diplomat, Jan Karski, visited the Warsaw ghetto, and he observed that Jews were deported. Later, he came to the United States and shared his observations with the Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. And Frankfurter said, "I cannot believe you." Another diplomat who came with Jan Karski, he said, "Are you saying Jan Karski is lying?" And Frankfurter responded, "I didn't say he is lying. I just said, I cannot believe it."
I think this is the problem with such a horrendous crime as organ harvesting. It is so terrible that people simply don't want to believe it. And it's difficult, of course, to find proof because all the bodies are incinerated, all evidence of the crime is erased, and we have to rely on the testament of those who, to give us a couple of examples. Somebody I interviewed had been to visit his mother at a prison in China, and on his way to see her, he'd noticed 2 prison guards outside a particular ward, and there were about a dozen people in this room. And he said to his mother, "What is going on down there? Why are there 2 policemen outside that ward?" And they said, and his mother said, "Well, those are Falun Gong prisoners awaiting organ transplants to be taken from them, not to be given to them, of course."
I would like to say to Western doctors to suspend your disbelief and actually inform yourself about what's going on. Ask yourself, how can Chinese doctors do so many transplants? How can Chinese transplant surgeons know nothing about procurement or where the organ came from? How can Chinese transplant hospitals make so much money? I would ask them to ask those questions and to be prepared to listen to the answers.
Evidence should never be dismissed just because of disbelief. We should continue to look into it. And the same applies to forced organ harvesting. Even if we cannot believe it, we should still look into it and not dismiss it. I would say it turns out that the COVID pandemic was actually helpful to bring our points across because people understood that the crime of forced organ harvesting was not out of the extraordinary. When we started to look into the evidence, at the beginning it was very tedious because it was not easy to find the silver bullet that would explain all of it. Naturally, it is very difficult to collect evidence in a country, in a totalitarian country, as it is in the case of China. So what happened is we were looking into small details here and there in the data and information, etc. So it became almost like putting a puzzle together where we find like little pieces, and although the little pieces don't give us the full picture, but they helped us to understand what was happening. And Over time, we found 5 categories where these pieces of evidence would fit into. So these 5 categories are our approach to summarize the evidence that we have collected. The first category, the most important one, is probably all the witness reports, the testimonies, because they give us very detailed information, they add credibility, and also it pushes us forward to look for more data.
My name is Feng Huang, born in 1960. I worked at the Chinese Academy of Sciences doing scientific research. I started practicing Falun Gong in 1995 because I've long been interested in martial arts and Qigong. On April 21st, at the Guangzhou Army General Hospital, the nurse took 2 tubes of blood, tested it, examined my eyes, and did an ECG. They asked if I used drugs. I said no, I don't smoke or use drugs. They said my heart was like a drug addict's. Dr. Lin on duty said I needed to stay for observation due to a fast heartbeat. At the same time, Dr. Dong from the Brainwashing Center called the center's chief, saying I needed heart surgery at 6:30 p.m. that day and to inform my family. But Dr. Lin corrected her, saying observation was enough, not surgery. Dr. Dong insisted on surgery within 3 hours. They asked if I'd signed authorization for the surgery. I refused. They sent me back to the Brainwashing Center instead of keeping me in the hospital. That was my first encounter with the organ harvesting attempt. It was dangerous. If I signed the authorization, I'd have been on the operating table with no control, possibly subjected to organ harvesting. They failed that day. Afterward, for 3 days, every hour, 8 people, police and security guards, force-fed me, beating me simultaneously. My weight dropped drastically and I nearly died. They failed to break me as I still couldn't eat or drink. They then sent me to the Guangdong Province Judicial Policeman Hospital. There, nurses took my blood, tested it, and injected me daily with unknown substances, just like at the Brainwashing Center. On June 5th, they examined all my organs, lungs, eyes, heart, kidneys, spleen, liver, using extensive ultrasound and X-ray scans. They used a lot of lubrication and paper, filling half a large container. The X-ray took over 30 minutes, scanning every detail from my neck to my lower body. For my heart, the doctor used a speakerphone, discussing my heartbeat with someone else over the phone, saying, "Listen to how strong and regular it is." The sounds were loud and clear.
My name is Xu Duo, born in 1969. I lived in Lianhu District, Xi'an City, Shanxi Province. I studied aerodynamics in university but gave it up after graduation. I worked at Shidian Company doing circuit design, then did other things. I partnered with friends to start a website. From 2008, I worked in computer programming and market research, mainly in financial engineering. After practicing Falun Gong, I quit smoking and drinking. My bad temper softened as I cultivated truth, compassion, and forbearance. My family, especially my brother, was amazed. I'd failed to quit smoking 3 times before, so this impressed him deeply. After the persecution of Falun Gong began, we tried to tell ordinary Chinese people that Falun Gong is good and that the Chinese Communist Party's CCP, baseless persecution, was wrong. We've been doing this truth clarification work, especially after the CCP staged the fake Tiananmen Square self-immolation in 2001 to defame Falun Gong. We've been explaining the facts. When many practitioners, including my former coordinator, were persecuted to death, we became even more committed to revealing the brutality of the persecution in China. In Chinese society, even the toughest people are reduced to lambs in the CCP's terrifying machine. I saw many inmates who were victims of this machine, but some became its accomplices. Before my persecution, I read about practitioners sentenced to 3, 5, or 8 years. Those numbers touched me, but they were just numbers. During my 18 days in detention, every day felt like a year, a living hell. That's when I understood what 3, 5, or 8 years meant. Without the belief in Falun Gong's principles of truth, compassion, and forbearance, you don't know if tomorrow brings life or death. On April 12th morning at Taoyuan Road Police Station, they wanted to test my blood. I refused, saying I feared they'd harvest my organs. A 610 official pointed at me fiercely and said, "We're gonna harvest your organs." That afternoon, handcuffed and escorted by 2 officers, I was taken to a hospital in Xi'an City Center for another blood test, ECG, blood pressure, and other checks. At Ankang Hospital, they did a full-body CT scan. I wondered why they tested my blood twice. Blood type doesn't change. The CT scan wasn't for my health. If they cared about my health, they'd have released me. I kept thinking about the 610 officials' words about organ harvesting. Would they do that to me? Upon arrival, they tried to inject me with an unknown liquid. I refused, so they strapped me to an iron chair, immobilizing my hands and feet, and injected me. From the next morning, they handcuffed me to a medical room bed and continued injecting liquids. After 18 days, by April 29, 2016, I was so weak they feared I'd die. They released me on bail, using my brother as a guarantor. For the first 6 months after release, I was on bail. They extended it by 3 months. On November 3, 2016, I faced an illegal trial. I defended myself, pleading not guilty, but there was no verdict, and I was sent home to wait.
It was the 2000, June 28th, and she was in her apartment or wherever she was living. They came up to knock on her door, but at the same time, coincidentally, she wasn't at home. She was outside. She wasn't able to go back home, and so she was homeless for 10 months. She had to find other ways of making, being able to stay alive. So she would feed just like the animals over there, like the pigs and the chickens. It was 2 o'clock in the morning.
来了有总有20个警察，跟那个朋友租的房子在北京住在一起，跟他讲。
She was living with friends and practitioners with her.
后来来了有20个警察，夜里他们就打开门，门一开就是拿着枪，说不准动，就对了。
So there were about 20-ish police officers who were armed with guns and whatever. They came into their home, their living area, and said, "Don't move."
就把我们抓到一个派出所里，带在一个铁笼子，一个铁的一个那里。
And they had them stay in a metal cage in the patrol area.
I met 2 practitioners, both were married, and Niu Jingping was the older of the 2. He was there with his small daughter. We filmed the interviews from behind the 2 Falun Gong practitioners to protect their identity. And what they told us was primarily about the persecution they and their wives had suffered. In the case of Niu Jingping, his wife Shan Yanying was in a woman's prison in Beijing, and he had seen her very, very rarely and with great difficulty, although he paid over 100,000 yuan for her release. She was still in prison, and indeed she was being beaten so severely that she had lost consciousness, and there is a photograph of her taken in the prison hospital where she was in a coma. And I was given to understand that this torture regime was typical. When later on Zhan Liangying was released from prison, she sent me a long email listing the 50 types of torture, escalating torture, from brainwashing up to physical abuse. For example, she was regularly suspended from her neck by a rope from the ceiling of the cell with her toes just touching the ground for hours on end. Torture like that, and ending up with beatings and so on, and concussion and then coma.
I also had the opportunity to interview some Falun Gong practitioners who escaped from prison. And basically they told me different experiences. One said she was actually detained for 2 years but was blood tested 10 times. And there's no reason for a practitioner who's subject to torture and forced labor to conduct a medical examination. So what happened is probably that this person was targeted 10 times as an organ donor, because you need the blood testing as a match before you can donate organs. This happens actually in other cases too, where in one detention camps about 200 Falun Gong practitioners were transported with buses to the hospital, and all of them were blood tested. In one case, there was one who resisted, and that person was pressed down on the ground by 8 guards just to force them to withdraw this blood. So it is almost like a forced medical examination that Falun Gong practitioners experience.
I think that there's no way to explain blood testing and other kinds of physical exams for people who are being detained and in some cases tortured. This can't be being done for their good health. So to me, it sounds like what's happening is that they are being blood typed, and you only need simple blood typing now for transplants because we have such good anti-rejection drugs. But blood typing vast pools of individuals would allow people to be able to find matches very, very quickly with very short waiting times. And in fact, that's what we know is going on in China today. I think that most people in the West don't have any idea that Falun Gong practitioners and other detainees are being blood tested. I don't think there's any knowledge about it in the West at all, except for very rare individuals who've actually looked into it themselves.
So when you hear reports from Falun Gong and others that they're being tested, there's blood examinations, tissue type examinations, it is because you're trying to make sure that you can quickly match a donor to a recipient. And it's another indication that you're not getting consent. You've already decided this person is going to become the organ donor. Moreover, it's not an accident. That's the people that you're looking at when you hear these reports are younger, healthier.
Another piece of evidence is that we have many witnesses from people in China who have been detained in Chinese detention camps and prisons. They had many very detailed medical examinations in the prison, testing their organs with X-ray and eye examinations and kidney and liver examinations. It was not that all prisoners were tested like this. Most of the prisoners tested were Falun Gong practitioners. They were selected for these medical examinations.
Well, I think it was the interviews with actual Falun Gong practitioners who had been detained, some of them tortured, some of them blood tested, and then escaped or were released. And I found their testimony quite compelling. And in addition, it was the fact that people had called Chinese hospitals, spoken to Chinese surgeons who actually admitted that this was going on. So I found that evidence to be a quite high level of evidence. I think there is still a large degree of incredulity on the part of some transplant surgeons who have not actually researched the evidence themselves and just don't believe, because they wouldn't do it, don't believe that colleagues in another country could be engaged in this sort of practice either.
The things that made it very credible for me were the multiple reports of examinations, of physical examinations from prisoners of conscience who were detained in the labour camps. It seemed that those stories, that evidence had come from those people around the world, people in Australia, in America, in Southeast Asia, who'd been incarcerated and escaped. And they all had the same story to tell, but they hadn't all had a chance to meet up and decide what story to tell. So it was coming independently from all these different stories. So to me, that made it seem very unlikely to be fabricated. How could you get all these different people fabricating the same story? So that seemed to me it was definitely true that people were being examined for their organ health and no other reason. So that was one thing that made me think that was true. Another was the sheer number of transplants that Chinese doctors had done, that hundreds of transplants. And again, in other countries, people don't do that many transplants. It's still a relatively uncommon operation in that there's always a shortage of organs. So the sheer number of transplants that the doctors had done was another convincing feature.
One of the most important pieces of evidence in forced organ harvesting is just the explosion of the number of transplants. Just simply looking at the volume of transplants that China was doing in the early 2000s. When you start to look at the data and you start to look at an explosion of transplant activity within China, you see numbers that just don't make sense. So in the 1990s, China, for example, by their own numbers, we're doing about 10 liver transplants per year as a country. There is no organ donation or distribution system that's active within China. And by about 2004, China does 3,000 plus liver transplants. So in a short time, they amped up their transplant activity, and specifically, especially within liver transplants. So the initial response by the Chinese transplant system was that this is coming from our organ donation system. But again, China doesn't have an organ donation system.
When we looked at the transplant data from China and observed and monitored it for several years, we saw a discrepancy between China and other countries. And numbers in other countries usually have a gradual increase. And you can compare it with when you come from the North Sea to Germany and Netherlands, the land is increasing very slowly. But when you come to China, I would compare it with crossing the US. You start off at the Pacific in Los Angeles, and all of a sudden, the numbers climb up like the Rocky Mountains, and afterwards, the people in the world notice or heard about forced organ harvesting, they drop down, and for 10 years, they just remain steady on the same level, around 10,000 per year, like the great plants. And then after 2016, they increased again, like crossing the Appalachian. And this is something that is really unusual, that the course of transplantations has such a different character.
The exponential growth in organ transplantation in China stands in contrast, total contrast, to what's going on in most other Western countries doing organ transplantation. In most other countries, there is a very slow growth of 1 or 2% organ transplantation more per year. We in Israel have managed to increase it in more than 10%, but to see an increase of tens and tens of percent in the number of transplant is something that hasn't been seen anywhere in the world.
I think the exponential increase in both organ transplants as well as persecution of Falun Gong is too coincidental not to be linked, and the fact that many of the Falun Gong detention camps were very close proximity to the large transplant centers, and in fact some of the same individuals were in charge of both persecution as well as transplant activities in China. All of that evidence suggests that these things are actually inextricably linked.
Well, China, if the numbers are correct, and I have no reason to doubt that they are not, has seen a 300% increase over the past 20 years, at least that much, in transplants done. They haven't seen, by anybody's imagination, a 300% increase in organ donation from those who have died and their families. I mean, it's a hard thing to shift to that. I understand it. We had a hard time doing it here. Every country that has tried to build an organ donation system finds resistance. Some people say, well, it's Chinese, it's cultural. It isn't. Israel, Denmark, the United States, everybody's had a hard path to make the move to trying to encourage people to donate organs when they die and to get families to be comfortable. But to push a 300% increase without having a cadaver system means there's only one other possible source. It's got to be prisoners. So I find myself thinking, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the claims, China still must be relying on prisoners as the only way to fuel that expansion, and that isn't right. It's still an unethical practice. Maybe it brings money, maybe people get transplants and they feel glad that their lives are extended, but murdering people to get parts is simply not the way to proceed.
The idea that the number of transplants has remained stable at 10,000 a year for the last 5 to 10 years is not credible. We know that the numbers were increasing rapidly until 2006, when China became aware that the world was starting to become curious about their transplant system. And since then, they seem to have settled on 10,000 as a reasonable number. But when you look at the number of transplants that individual surgeons have done, it's not believable that only 10,000 a year are done when some surgeons are doing 200 each, which can rapidly add up when you've got thousands of surgeons across China.
Hughes at the time when he was still Vice Minister of Health in China. He gave a presentation at the Transplant Congress in Madrid in 2010, and he presented slides to the audience, 40 slides, and he gave, in these slides, there were statistics, aggregated statistics, overall statistics for all of China, how many kidney transplants, how many liver transplants, and so on. And in these 40 slides, there were heavily conflicting transplant numbers in the same presentation. But I can give you still another example. In these slides, there were numbers about transplants from living persons donating their kidney. And in 2006, they gave a number of 300 such transplants of living donors. And the next year, 2007, they gave the number of 1,700 organs. So within 1 year, such a big five-fold increase of voluntary donations, that's basically impossible, especially in China, where the population is very aversive to organ donation. So these numbers can't be true, and there is some mystery behind them, and I doubt that these were all voluntary donations.
The third category are the short wait times. So when you go to a hospital here in the US, you have probably to wait 5 years for a kidney or a year for a liver. But in China, it is common practice that you can get any type of organs within 2 weeks. And in some cases, it was actually demonstrated that you can get an organ within 1 or 2 days. It was even reported in Chinese media that this happened.
So to be able to get a transplant on demand would mean that you have a vast number of people that you can analyze to select a most appropriate donor.
Well, yeah, the disjunct between procurement and transplantation is one. The short waiting times, the availability, that was another red flag, that you could have this many organs available so quickly. The short emergency waiting times, again, that's information that's come out more recently from the update with some hospitals with extraordinarily short waiting times. I think the shortest was at 4 hours to get a liver transplant, which again is just astonishing that you could get a transplant that quickly, an emergency transplant. So those are the kinds of things that you wouldn't get in a system such as Australia, where people go onto waiting lists. There's not a very quick and ready supply of organs. Extraordinarily short waiting times that are not replicated anywhere in the world. So that seemed to me there's something very unique about the Chinese system that couldn't be explained by any of the normal mechanisms for even people selling kidneys and so on. You wouldn't get matches that quickly, I don't think. So that was one thing.
The patient has been waiting for an organ donor for 3 years in Korea. But it took just a few minutes for the doctor to say, "We can do it right away." How long does the patient have to wait to get a transplant?
저희는 최대한 빨리 다른 방법이 없을까요? 대기 시간을 줄이거나.
都不好说的，都不好说. 일주일 될 걸요. 어떤 사람들은 막 이튿날도 되는 사람도 있고, 오래 기다리는 사람들은 한 달, 한 달 반 기다리는 사람도 있고, 많으면 막 일주일, 며칠 기다리는 사람도 있고 그렇습니다. 어떻게 더 빨리 할 수 있는 길을, 그 루트를 알아보면 우리가 기금에다 기부를 한다. 내가 다른 정상적인 비용 내가 안 낸다. 내가 기부를 할게.
얼마 정도 더?
10만 원, 중국 돈을 10만 원 내지 1,500만 정도.
원래 수술비용은 얼마?
수술비용은 우리가 한국 사람들이 한 70만 정도.
이제 4천 플러스 이제 저희가 스무 좀 땡길 수 있는 방법은 기부금을 내는 거다.
그러면 만약에 장기 나오면 우리가 맞으면 군국보다도 먼저 할 수 있는 이런 기회를 가질 수 있구나. 너도 원장님한테 청시해서 이런 분은 많은데 이제 이렇게 하겠다 한다 하면 원장님 오케이.
In 2013, China introduced a so-called public organ donation program, and around the world the medical doctors were relieved because now China is on the right path. But that's actually not true, because we found plenty of discrepancies and flaws in this organ donation program. Basically, this organ donation program is an illusion. It's a decoy so that doctors in the West are pacified.
One of the important things to understand about China and Southeast Asia is within the cultural fabric of China, there's an ancient belief, actually based on Confucius, that out of respect for your mother and father, when you die, the body should stay intact going into the next life. And this is out of the respect for the hair and the skin and the bones that your mother and father provided for you. There's really a cultural opposition to transplant within Southeast Asia and in China specifically. Even to say, well, there's a large number of Chinese, so these transplant volumes make sense. It simply doesn't make sense without having some victim group, some population that is functioning essentially as a population that's killed on demand for organ transplants.
Given the fact that, number one, there's no brain death law in China, number two, the idea of brain death is totally strange to the majority of the Chinese population, and the fact that most Chinese population do not trust the medical system, and therefore to think that this type of population who is still deeply entrenched in the belief that the body is sacred and should not be desecrated by donating organ, to think that this type of population would miraculously starting to voluntarily donate organs in the numbers that will replace the thousands and thousands of organs that have previously been donated by executed prisoners is something totally inconceivable, and therefore the only other explanation for the exponential increase in the number of transplants would be if there is an extrajudicial source of organs in that country.
I don't think the culture will change overnight. No matter how you educate people, if the education is so efficient, why the other education, like people's moral value or something like that, never have effect? That means it's still a lie. It's just a public relation for the international community.
I do not believe that the system has changed in terms of transparency or in terms of meeting the actual guidelines for organ transplantation that are internationally accepted. What I do believe happened was a bit of a semantic trick in terms of how do we define voluntary donations. I do not believe that anything has changed in the People's Republic of China when it comes to organ transplantation. They've tried to obfuscate the issue. To this day, they continue to hide this elephant in the room in the plain sight of the international community. I do not believe anything has changed to date.
Given that China's only had a voluntary organ donation system for a very short period of time, it seems astonishing that they should be able to have those numbers of transplants so quickly when we haven't been able to achieve that in other countries where we've been working for a very long time to try and increase our organ donation rate. My guess is that the figures are falsified, that they're inflated in some way. There's one other feature that's very interesting about those figures. In Australia, where we have some of the world's best practice, we, on average, can only get livers from about 60% of our organ donors. The liver's a very sensitive organ, and it's very hard to have a donor where you can get a healthy liver. And so the best we can do in Australia is 60%. And in Australia, 3/4 of our donations come from patients who are brain dead, which is the patients where you have the best possible quality livers in general. In China, by contrast, they get livers from 80% of their donors, which is extraordinarily high. It's 60% compared to 80%. And the other thing about that is that in China, they don't have consistent brain death legislation. So most of their transplants come from donation after circulatory death, which is very difficult to get healthy livers. So there's something very strange going on in China. How are they able to get livers from 80% of their donors when they're mainly being certified dead on circulatory criteria, and we know that compromises the liver?
The liver is the one that's particularly sensitive to that situation because the bile ducts of the liver require a lot of oxygen. It's probably one of the most vascular or blood vessel filled areas of the body because those bile duct cells require so much oxygen. If a person goes through this process of donation after cardiac death, and it takes too long for them to expire, and we take that liver anyway and transplant it into a patient, it might work, but 3 or 4 months down the road, we're going to have problems with bile duct necrosis, death of the bile duct cells, infections inside the liver because of damage done to the bile duct, and that person will have to have a transplant again. That's why only about 30% of the time when we think that we're going to get organs from a donor after cardiac death are we actually able to use the liver. To me, there's only one plausible explanation, and that is there are a group of people that are being set aside as potential donors. They're being evaluated ahead of time. They're being kept in some place until there's a potential recipient. And then that person is having their organs procured after whatever means it is that they claim is the means by which that person died. And that death was probably brought about by someone who wanted to make the death progress quickly or even not even completely before procuring those organs in order to protect the liver, because the liver is going to be the most sensitive to problems with the bile duct during the process of death. So either death is not quite completely occurring before organs are being removed, or the death is being progressed very rapidly so that the organs can be removed rapidly, primarily to protect the liver. To me, there's no other plausible explanation as to how so many organs can be ready on a moment's notice to transplant a patient within hours of them being placed on a list, if there is a list. That's the only explanation I can see.
Organ transplant registries take many, many years, decades to set up in all of the countries that have them. In China, it's only been 3 years since the organ registry was set up. And to have all of their organs supplied by this registry in that period of time is not believable. It's not credible. It's not consistent with evidence we have from any other country, even countries which have very, very advanced systems of organ lodging of types of organs and blood typing and transplant mechanisms for getting organs across large distances very rapidly, which you have to do. All of that coordination of materials and information and computer data is not existent in China as far as we know with this registry system across the vast land of China. So I think it's not credible on any level, and it's completely inconsistent with what we see in every other organ registry around the world. Unfortunately, I think that there are examples of fabrication of data across Chinese industries, whether it's healthcare or baby formulas or building standards or bridge materials or medical pharmaceutical products. There are many, many examples of China not being completely truthful in what's going on. So I think we have to take everything that comes out of the medical system in China with a grain of salt. We have to have many sources to replicate data before we can actually believe what is said. But there's no way that 25,000 people being on a registry could actually be the only source for 3,000 or 4,000 donors in a given year. It's not possible. I think that the number of donors who are registered compared to the number of transplants in China is very high. So in America, for example, there are 150 million people registered to be donors, and every year 15,000 of them die and become donors, or people who are on and off that list. So that's a huge ratio. So to have a third of the people on the transplant list becoming donors in China, for example, last year, is not believable by any standard.
We conducted another analysis where we looked into the organ donation program and the numbers of registered organ donors and simply applied the death rate in the country on these numbers. One would expect that the death rate applies to registered organ donors as much as to non-registered organ donors because it's just the population. So what we found is that at the end, about only 1% of the registered organ donors become actual organ donors. And this is observed in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Denmark, and other countries. This is a steady number. But when we look into the official numbers that we observe from China, then you find that actually 12% of the registered organ donors become actual organ donors. So somehow in China, the registered organ donors died 12 times as much as in other countries.
I think it's impossible that China has gone from a system of 100% or nearly 100% of organs being harvested from prisoners to 100% being harvested from ordinary citizens, if you will, in 3 years. I think it's impossible. And I think something that is quite disturbing is the fact that Huang Jiafu at least 2 press conferences has actually stated that he has reclassified prisoners as citizens capable of donation. And as we heard from his earlier press conference on the 730 report, he doesn't understand why people would object to that. He doesn't see the moral problem with coercive consent for people who are imprisoned. So therefore, it is very, very dangerous to believe his words and his colleagues' words that citizens who are not prisoners anymore or who are capable of consent form the vast bulk of organ donors.
We've stated in our American Journal of Transplant paper the fact that it's inconceivable to accept the fact, the declared fact, that the number of organ transplantation which have so far been used by executed prisoners in China has miraculously been replaced within only 1 to 2 years by the voluntary donation of the Chinese population.
Transparency is the most important criteria. Transparency creates trust, and that is crucial in the field of transplant medicine because you have 3 people involved, which is the doctor, the organ recipient, and the organ donor. That is very rare in the medical profession that you have 3 people involved. And usually in the civilized world, that is happening, where all 3 parts are treated with respect and that there's transparency between all of them. But in China, this trust cannot exist because there's no transparency.
Transplant is the only field where you have someone giving them of themselves, giving a part of themselves to someone else to save their life. It's the whole foundation of transplant is built on a gift of one person to another. And to see that part of transplant so ignored and bastardized the way that it's being done in China is despicable.
The national transplant community urges China to make their system transparent. Without transparency, it's impossible to say if this system will improve or not improve. So we need transparency, and not only transparency, we also need scrutiny. Both transparency and scrutiny are demanded by organ transplantation principles of the World Health Organization. And the international community, represented by the so-called transplantation societies, it's an international society with about 6,000 or more members, all transplant doctors. They have a big influence in China. If they refuse to work together with China, China has a big problem because in medical science, you need exchange with your colleagues worldwide to make progress. So if the international community refuses to cooperate, China has to make its system transparent. So this is very, very important.
The last category is probably the expansion of the transplant infrastructure itself. It was reported that although the official numbers did not increase, hospitals were actually reporting increase of revenues. They had more doctors working, they had more hospitals, more than actually the donor numbers would explain.
It seems from information taken from the website of the 309 military hospital that their income over 5 years increased from organ transplantation. So it increased from 30 million yuan to 34 million between 2006 and 2010. This seems extraordinary that there would be enough organ transplants to generate, first of all, that kind of profit, and then that hugely rapid increase in profit over a short period of time.
To this date, China is the only nation on earth that has systematically used both its military as well as its civilian hospital system in collaboration with the judiciary as well as the prison system to systematically harvest organs from individuals prisoners of conscience, and they do so for profit. So at this point, China still is the country with the greatest number of executions, exceeding that of all other nations combined. This can be compared with the genocide in Rwanda. This can be compared to the Holocaust, and certainly the psychological impact of this globally as well as on the citizens of the People's Republic of China will be felt for decades to come. Even if this stopped today, the psychological backlash and impact will still be felt for many years to come. And I do not think we're adequately prepared for that today.
I think the magnitude of the crime against humanity that continues to go on is so big that it's simply impossible to grasp by anybody who is not really involved in organ transplantation. And the fact that there's no videotapes or pictures never taken inside these prisons or inside the hospitals where this forced organ harvesting is done is a problem, a part of the problem to bring the message of this crime against humanity to the entire world. I mean, you have to be really a professional and see the numbers that are coming out of China in order to believe that this crime is really taking place in China.
We also have it as our mission to inform the medical community and the public about this atrocity. And we did this with different means. One was, for example, a petition that we had over 5 years where we collected 3 million signatures. Another approach was writing articles in medical journals. Then we have organized more than 24 webinars in different countries to basically inform doctors in those countries about this practice. Another campaign was our World Summit, where we invited 39 speakers from around the world to discuss this topic of forced organ harvesting.
In June 2024, the G7+7 petition was initiated to speak directly to the G7 leaders and bring them the voice of the people of free and democratic countries, asking them to stop forced organ harvesting in China. By learning about Falun Gong, its practice, its belief, and how the Chinese Communist Party has persecuted Falun Gong for 27 years, this petition will break the imposed silence.
I guess one of the questions I was asked earlier is, why am I so involved? And I think I've always been somebody who stands up for the underdog. And I think this is ultimately one of the biggest underdog good versus evil stories that we've seen, especially within the medical community. And I feel passionate about the work I do for Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, an organization that has been nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize, won the Mother Teresa Social Justice Award in 2019. Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting represents really a voice for the voiceless. There's a 680-page report that's available online called The Bloody Harvest, The Slaughter and Update. And they looked at about 160 different transplant centers through China. In this 2016 report, their conclusion was that China was doing about 60 to 100,000 transplants per year as a country. To put that into context, officially the United States is the leading transplant country in the world in terms of volume. Last year, the United States did 48,000 transplants. And so you're talking about a system, a very nascent system, when you compare to the United States, something that even if you take the Chinese transplant system at its word is only 10 years old in terms of an organ donation system, and they're outperforming us, by a third.
When it comes to organizations, transplant organizations, medical organizations, we sometimes observe obstacles from the leadership of these organizations. And it's not just like a lack of belief or not comprehending it, but rather a willful blindness, I would say. So we also wondered why the leadership of these medical and transplant organizations were not willing to look into forced organ harvesting, were not willing to do their own investigations. We realized that it is not only like a willful blindness, but also probably interest to have the opportunity to go to China, because if they would look into it, they would probably not be invited if there is a conference or congress in China.
In the last 2 years, the American Transplantation Society and the World Transplantation Society, where Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting used to be able to have a voice, be able to be admitted to the meeting and have a booth and talk to those that are interested or those that are concerned or those that may not know about forced organ harvesting, we are now a censored group and outcast by these two transplantation meetings. Instead of saying, well, we can produce data, we can produce evidence that China continues to use innocent lives, innocent human beings, killing them on demand for organ transplants. Where's the data that it's not happening? We are no longer invited into those meetings.
By taking the stance that things are fine in China, without evidence, without audit, without any clear demonstration of a shift in practice, the WHO risks losing its leadership role as an ethical beacon or light on these matters. And that would be tragic because no one else is in a position to hold that role.
So obviously, the victim of forced organ harvesting is being killed and incinerated, so there are no traces. And the doctors who committed will not say that they just killed a person and removed the organs from that person. The news media had a kind of like expectation in the evidence that simply cannot be fulfilled. It is illusional. And we need a different approach to handle the expectations on evidence.
I think one of the reasons why people don't believe it is because it just simply seems so unbelievable. And the fact that something like this can still happen in the 21st century, I think people do just find very difficult to understand. And I think without any concrete evidence, because the problem is the lack of transparency, openness, there's no magic bullet that we can show people to say, well, here you are, here is your concrete evidence. And all the evidence that we have comes piecemeal from lots of different sources. And from our perspective, we look at all of those different pieces of information to get our impression as to what we think is going on. I think for some people, especially if they are not medically qualified or if they don't have an understanding about transplantation, they can't fully comprehend the allegations that we are putting forward. And I think there is a lack of awareness on this issue.
The international transplant community, as I understand it, first of all, was very condemning of organ harvesting from prisoners, and then chose a pathway of trying to work with China to improve their system. And I can understand the wish to try and help China to improve their system, because clearly it's a horrendous system. But I'm afraid that some of the doctors have been naive. A good example of this is the recent Transplant Society conference, which was held in Hong Kong for the first time. This was immediately portrayed in the Chinese media as a sign that the world welcomed China onto the transplant stage. It was seen as condoning Chinese transplant. It was seen as a celebration of the great strides being made in Chinese transplantation. I think it's very serious because it then people come away thinking, oh, things are changing. I've been to China, they showed me a list of voluntary donors, or people go to China and believe what they see. And I don't think they realize that they're not being shown what's actually happening there, being shown the face that China wants to show the world. And because we don't do that to the same extent in this country, people just don't understand it. I mean, we certainly, we show people our nicest hospitals, we show people our, cleverest surgeons, but we don't create something like a theatre set when we have international visitors. But I think when Australian doctors go to China to look at the transplant system, they're basically getting a theatre set.
The fact that the Chinese authorities have allowed for a pre-prepared, pre-arranged visit of medical experts from the West of only 6 out of the more than 600 transplant centers, and they didn't find, so to speak, any evidence of forced organ harvesting in that particular visit, doesn't say a thing. This particular visit brought into mind a similar visit by the Red Cross during the World War II into the Theresienstadt concentration camp, where it was prearranged and it was shown to this particular group of visitors as if it was a nice, quiet, cozy recreation camp of the Jewish kids.
And the fact that they aren't willing to have independent investigators going or a transparency with regards to their data, their transplantation numbers by center. They usually provide us with aggregate numbers, which we cannot verify. Most of the registries that they have for liver transplants, kidney transplants, heart and lungs, you can't verify any of the data. So the fact that they don't want any investigations of their numbers, they don't allow any independent investigations of their practice, would suggest that they do have something to hide.
We know that in the New South Wales Parliament, when a member of Parliament attempted to hold a conversation about organ harvesting in China and to propose a bill to address that, members of Parliament received a letter from the Chinese embassy suggesting that it would be better not to go to the meeting because they wouldn't want to jeopardise the cordial relations. So we see a lot of overt and covert threats against speaking out because China wields such huge economic power at the moment.
Our organization, as well as other organizations and investigators who look into the forced organ harvesting, have certainly triggered the Chinese government and pushed them to reply to it. And the official reply is that this does not happen. So they deny it, and they even pay the media in the West to not report about it. There are probably like two major aspects. One is that China is paying a large amount of money to have inserts in different newspapers. So of course, if the newspaper is reporting about forced organ harvesting, then they lose the business for these inserts. But another aspect is that there are courageous journalists who report about it. That happened, for example, with Didi Tadlov, who worked for the New York Times some years ago, and she was courageous enough to report about this forced organ harvesting, but her work was not appreciated, and at one point she just decided to leave the journal.
I've been joining my friends in Dafo in this fight against forced organ harvesting in China for the past 11 years. There were ups, there were downs, there were times that we, myself, thought that we are fighting against forces that are far, far beyond our power.
I think the small handful of countries that have put in place legislation or regulations preventing their citizens from traveling to mainland China to receive an organ from this particular source certainly is an example for the rest of us. Certainly, we know that there is not always the political appetite to do the right thing, but part of our duty is to raise awareness and to not stop doing so until this issue is resolved.
It was not easy to get people's attention, but over the years we were breaking through these obstacles, these walls, and these sometimes willful blindness, which resulted in more and more people were standing up and learning about it. And it also was an inspiration to other groups. So we see now, for example, films, for example, State Organs, which has received tremendous feedback from the audience, we see that more and more governments are willing to consider legislations, and it is more and more discussed in other media and, for example, podcasts and webinars. So I would say right now we see, after many years of breaking through the wall, that now the wall has some cracks and the information is reaching the public. There's a saying that goes, truth will prevail. And this also holds true with our work.
There is a really big weekly in Germany, very well known and very widespread, and it's called Die Zeit. And a journalist working for this weekly, she did a big article and also did interviews for this big article on forced organ harvesting in China. And she went to the US to the head of the Chicago Transplant Center. And she made an interview with him. And she also asked, do you know about the allegations that organs from Falun Gong practitioners are harvested for transplantation? And this doctor is also an advisor of the Chinese government for organ transplantation. And he answered, oh, this is not in the focus of my interest. There are many things I can't be interested in. So I only care about improving the Chinese system. I don't care about what you ask. And I think this is a very good example of how some important transplant leaders turn a blind eye on the allegations of a crime against humanity. I think it's really frightening if this answer, if you don't care even about crimes against humanity, what have you as an ethical responsibility?
When we bring up the topic of forced organ harvesting, the Chinese government often replies by saying this is a political topic and they don't want to talk about it. And this was a way to dissuade doctors in the whole world to even mention forced organ harvesting. And I would say the Chinese government was right. I would say that ethics, and especially the Hippocratic Oath, was probably the first political statement in medicine where it says, do no harm, do not kill people. So in this regard, they are right. It's a political topic and we should not shy away to address forced organ harvesting.
About a month ago, I was talking to a colleague of mine who's a liver transplant expert. She trained at the leading liver transplant system in California in the United States. She had no idea that forced organ harvesting was happening, what it is, how it's defined, what the evidence is, how much evidence there is out there. I think you've had this erosion of, I guess, the Renaissance man, for lack of a better term, within a medical system where you're sort of expert on multiple things. And so I think there's often a desire to say, go talk to this one person, they're the expert. Instead of saying, it's my duty, it's my obligation to, as an individual, understand and come up with my own determination of whether it's happening and my own determination of what I'm going to do about it and what we should do about it. There is still a huge lack of awareness within the medical system and even within the transplant system.
At one point, I realized something that I experienced myself in my medical studies, in my medical training. We're supposed to rotate between different disciplines in medicine. And one of the disciplines was surgery. So I was helping out with some, holding hooks, etc., and assisting. And I was basically thinking about what I learned in the textbooks. And at one point, I realized that, the surgeon is cutting the skin of the patient. And when I started to think, then I started actually to faint. And later, actually, the doctor told me that this is normal. This happens to many, many students, but it only happens once. I came to the insight that at that moment, my knowledge shifted from textbook knowledge to real life knowledge. And that is the knowledge that is really needed to understand what forced organ harvesting is. If there's no emotional reaction, then you're probably still in the textbook knowledge where you hear verbally forced organ harvesting, but you don't actually realize that people are killed so that the organs can be harvested.
I think the transplant community has been problematic. I can understand the difficulty. If you make this public and make this known to every individual within the medical community, as well as the public at large, you may have a large population of people that no longer want to be organ donors, and you have essentially pushed the transplant field to the limits of absurdity, to the point that you have lost trust by a well-intentioned public. And so there have been groups that have taken a stance, but I think what you see more often is silence. And the reason that I think you see is silence is it's trying to keep the field of transplant clean. One of the issues that we're dealing with now is that in December of 2014, a Chinese transplant surgeon, Wang Jifu, made a statement at a seminar in China saying that by January 1st of 2015, China would stop using executed criminals for transplant.
How do you expect that we should have you run the world if this is how you treat your own people? That's the same thing with what's taking place with communist China. How it treats the Falun Gong is more than barbaric, forced organ harvesting.
By 1998 or 1999, the Chinese official numbers were that there were somewhere between 70 and 100 million Falun Gong practitioners. It had spread mostly by word of mouth. Falun Gong was really resonating with the ancient traditions within China. This was something that I think was a huge threat to the Chinese Communist Party, which was not rooted in ancient Chinese ideology, ancient Chinese concepts like respect for the divine, respect for your family, the fact that you do unto others as you would want done to you. I mean, a lot of the elements that I think permeated ancient Chinese civilization resonated with the Chinese people through Falun Gong. And so through mostly word of mouth, the practice exploded. Jiang Zemin, who was head of the Chinese Communist Party, I think was very jealous. The Chinese Communist Party is used to coercing people through threat, terrorizing them, through fear and intimidation, through lies and deception. But Falun Gong represented something different. It was resonating with the hearts of people who were practicing something that, again, I think really resonated with ancient values and ancient energy practices that were commonplace through China.
What Falun Dafa believes in is truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance or forbearance. And then the Chinese government, what they believe in is completely flipped, and so just like completely opposites. They just fear anything else besides them gaining more power, and so they wanted to put it to a stop.
On July 20th of 1999, Jiang Zemin set in motion a flooding of innocent prisoners of conscience within the Chinese prisons, labor camps, detention centers, brainwashing centers across China. In fact, the United States State Department at one point estimated that more than half of victims in labor camps within China were Falun Gong practitioners. Ethan Gutman estimates that the number of Falun Gong practitioners that were being imprisoned, detained, tortured throughout China was about 450,000 to 1 million. If you take 70 to 100 million practitioners of Falun Gong in the late 1990s, even if you have 1% of them within prisons and within prison systems, you have about that number. You have close to 1 million innocent lives that are languishing and essentially dehumanized by the Chinese Communist Party within their detention centers and their labor camps.
There are different incentives. The doctors who practice the forced organ harvesting, they get paid in money, and the salary is often dozen times higher than the regular salary that they would earn otherwise. So it is a very profitable, lucrative business for doctors in China to commit the forced organ harvesting. But there's another side to it, and that is the incentive of helping to eradicate, to destroy Falun Gong practitioners, and that is in the interest of the Chinese government. They started to destroy this group since 1999, but were not able to stop it. So they were looking for another way to achieve their goal, and this way the forced organ harvesting became like the final solution for the Chinese government, where they can slowly eliminate, exterminate all Falun Gong practitioners in China without the international community actually noticing it.
Jiang Zemin saw much more in Falun Gong than a simple health exercise and a Buddhist religious practice. Jiang Zemin wanted to destroy Falun Gong and its belief. He wanted to dirty it and humiliate it through brainwashing, torture, rape, social and psychological rejection, so that no Chinese citizen or anyone else in the world would ever listen to Falun Gong practitioners. He used all of the People's Republic of China's power and finances to ensure global silence on the subject of Falun Gong.
Some of the estimates even 10 years ago in 2015 or so is that this was a $9 billion industry within China and a major economic interest of the Chinese Communist Party. So there is a side benefit, I think, of money, but I don't think money is essentially what it was about for the Chinese government. I think for the Chinese Communist Party, the intention was to eradicate a population from the face of the planet, to terrorize that group so much that other people that were Falun Gong practitioners would be too afraid to continue practice, and essentially carry out the edict of Jiang Zemin, who in 1999 said, "We will destroy them physically, we will bankrupt them financially, and we will ruin the reputation of Falun Gong practitioners within China," which was what he set out to do. And as far as I can tell, even with Xi Jinping today, this has been something that has never been reversed in terms of the intent.
We're constantly talking about prisoners when we look at China, but there are all kinds of prisoners. There are prisoners there who are prisoners of conscience. They may be there because of spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs they have. They may be there because they are ethnic minorities, unhappy with the central government. They may be political prisoners, in other words. They may also be people who are convicted with very harsh sentences of financial crimes and other things. So there are all kinds of prisoners. So when we lump them together, we're missing the fact that some of the prisoners shouldn't be there. Some of them are inappropriate prisoners. They shouldn't be in that situation. And then using them to say, well, you have a death sentence. And because you belong to a spiritual group or a religious group or whatever political persuasion, we're going to kill you to get parts, that's obviously wrong. Ironically, the very health habits that Falun Gong might pursue, no drinking, no smoking, moderation in lifestyle, lead them to be healthier, and they're younger usually. That makes them even more of interest if you're looking for healthy organs. So it's kind of a targeting, if you will, of who's likely to be the best organ donor. And then you have this pre-testing, which we don't do with donors here. We basically see who donates, then test them after their death to find out who they might match. But when you're doing it beforehand, it's sending a signal. These are people we intend to kill in order to get their parts.
Well, my concerns are that people who are prisoners because of their beliefs, generally religious beliefs, are being treated as a commodity. They're being, instead of being treated as human beings with the rights that should be extended to all human beings, they're treated as a living organ bank who can be killed whenever it's deemed necessary in order to put a transplant into someone who can pay for it. So essentially, instead of being treated as an individual with rights who deserves respect and dignity, they're treated as a walking, talking organ bath from whom the organs can be removed at convenience.
I think there's a unwillingness to look into the details of what has happened in China, and there's a perception that it's just too big and too vast and too different, and so maybe things do happen on a different time scale. Maybe if it's a state-sanctioned system, maybe they are able to set up a registry within 3 years instead of 3 decades. So I think it's a real kind of Western ignorance of maybe how things work. If you've never worked in China, maybe you don't know how things operate there, and so you will believe what people tell you. I think that's really what's happened.
I think if the public at large recognizes what has happened and recognizes the fact that we sat on our hands as a medical community for decades, I think that's a huge threat to the initial obligation to care for patients, to care for them in a way to ease the suffering of human lives, to ease the suffering of the human experience, to help patients that are afflicted with various disorders. We've lost any kind of trust. We have pushed medicine to such an absurd point that it simply becomes a farce. I went into medicine really with the hope and the promise that I would understand the human condition and that I would be able to ease the suffering and help human beings in a way that was exceptionally meaningful. And I still get to do that. But if forced organ harvesting isn't addressed, you simply have all of medicine that becomes an absurd practice.
We have observed this struggle between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government and Falun Gong practitioners. And you can compare it with the spin top. It's the struggle between gravity that wants to drag down the spin top and the centrifugal force that helps the spin top to spin. If Falun Gong has all the freedom to practice its faith, then you can say it has overcome the gravity of the CCP, the control. It has shaken off the control from the Communist Party. And then you see the spin top spinning freely. And if you take it to the next level, then the spin top is not just spinning, but actually almost dancing. And this is what you can observe when you see Shenyun, where Falun Gong practitioners express the freedom of their faith on stage.
She wants people to know the cruelty of the Chinese government and the CCP.
感谢你给我们这个机会。
Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
谢谢。
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing what we have worked with our NGO and with countless helpers over 20 years. We would like now to offer you a short, maybe 45 minutes of questions that you might have, and we have with me Keith Warrer. He's the filmmaker who helped us to put this film together. And Weldon Gilcrease, our deputy director at DAFO, he will join us, and myself. And there will be microphones available for your questions.
Raise our hands to do a question, or I don't need a mic. Anyway, that was excellent. Well done. I strongly recommend, and maybe you've already done this, is that you have 3 versions of this, maybe a 15-minute, a 30-minute, a 60, and a 90. Depending upon what venue you're using, because it would be nice. Because I was thinking that at CMP it would have been great if you had like an hour version. You could have had a standalone or an offering there at CMP. It would have been great because we could have had a lot of folks interested in this. But so I would recommend that you have those versions depending upon the venue, and then you could have a quick look, and then you have your longer look depending upon how much time you get. But sometimes you have to have an elevator speech to get somebody interested quickly because you can't get them for 90 minutes. Anyway, excellent presentation. I was wondering, how do we affect major change here? We've got an insular society, a communist society that they own everything. But we have this movement, of course, that is looking at freedom and faith in some ways. And then they're using that as kind of their cattle to supply organs. And then we have around the world, and especially maybe in the United States, we have a clientele. We have families that are losing somebody, dying, and they're very, very eager to be able to get an organ. They'll do anything. So I noticed that the U.S. is not on that list. So is it wide open for clientele to go from the U.S. to China to go ahead and get donations at this point?
I mean, I'll make a comment.
Okay.
There have been states that have passed bills. Utah is one of them. Idaho is another one. I think Tennessee, Texas. There may be 2 other states. So there are states like Utah.
They have limitation.
Yeah,
okay.
passed an adjunct to a bill saying that the insurance companies are forbidden to pay for transplants that are done in China. So there has been some legislation, but I still think it gets to the point of how do we just make everyone more aware. I think those bills kind of come and go. They're in a number of states. There are 2 bills in the Senate right now that passed through the House of Representatives. One is S4009. It's the Falun Gong and Victims of Forced Organ Harvesting Protection Act.
Okay, that's great. That's
great. So there is. I think there has been legislation in the United States to try to, and the way I view it is to just try to bring more awareness. I mean, part of the problem I think that we run into is the problem of protected health information. I mean, I think a lot of patients, you don't know who's gone, who. We also don't know who we've trained at our university. So I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do, but we have certainly been intimately involved with the killing machine or the murder machine that's happening in China. We've trained them, and we've also had United States citizens that have gone abroad to get unethically sourced organs.
Okay, great. No, thank you. And kind of a discussion on what kind of actions you're trying to affect, that would be very helpful. So thank you.
I would like to comment on your starting point, making different versions, 5 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes. We did this before in terms of reaching out to people. And if there's really no time, then we have a 3-minute trailer. That would be our elevator pitch. But we also notice, as was mentioned in the film, oftentimes the people stay on the textbook knowledge, on the just abstract understanding of forced organ harvesting. And the question is, are we willing to cut out 90 minutes out of our life and dedicate it to watch this movie? Because it takes 90 minutes, if you want, or maybe a few minutes less, it takes this amount of time to really understand, to really have this reality of forced organ harvesting go under our skin. So if it's like too short, our experience is that it doesn't really touch people. But so far, my experience is from having people watching this film, that this film is changing people. Nobody walks out of watching this film without being unchanged. And it might be that these 90 minutes are a well-spent time really to understand and go out to change it. Your second point was, what can we do? This comes after watching that people have this wish to, or this understanding, we need to change something, and they go out and do something. So the film has a little bit of an open ending, if you wish. And this is also by intention, because we want to inform and move people to take action. But what action they take, that is also up to each individual. Of course, now we have the Senate bill, and if you want to help, call your senator, your federal senator, and ask him to co-sponsor expeditiously to pass this bill before this, in this case, before summer 2026, to get it passed.
Trey and gentlemen, thank you very much for your 20-year journey, and thank you for bringing this to our attention. I have a comment, lamentation, and a question. So the comment, lamentation is, in this new world that we're living in, where ethics don't count anymore, and where the WHO and the International Tribunal are belittled and became non-functional, I really don't know which way to go, except maybe through the Senate and so on, but in DC we don't have a representative. But anyhow, my question is, you brought very well to our attention what's happening in China, but organ donations which are coerced, either because of poverty or whatever means we have in society, are not there in China alone. I mean, they're everywhere. Latin America, India, and so on and so forth. So are you doing anything yourselves to combat that? Are you bringing this to the attention of the world along with what's happening in China?
Yes, of course. If you look at what happened at the Holocaust, there were many groups were actually subject to the persecution and to the genocide. But we know that the largest group of victims were the Jewish people. So if you want to stop the Holocaust and you start with the Gypsies, who were also persecuted, then this is missing the point. You start with the largest group. There is forced organ harvesting in other countries, but it is not industrialized. In China, it's an industry. Tens of thousands of people are killed, and the whole transplant business in China is based on this industry of killing prisoners of conscience systematically. You don't have this systematic killing for organs in other countries.
I'll add a comment too. So you bring up a really important point, and that's the difference between black market organs, where you have a rogue group of doctors, surgeons, usually not killing the victim, taking maybe a kidney, maybe part of a liver nowadays. This is very different, and I think that's one important thing. But one thing that I'll point out, I think because in 2006, when we were first made aware, just like Torsten had mentioned earlier, a couple of miles from here, 20 years and maybe a month ago, the world first heard about forced organ harvesting. Because there wasn't a stance
in support of Falun Gong victims when we knew this was happening. This has spread to other populations within China. So kind of to your point, I think if you don't take a stance at something this horrific, you're going to see it bleed through different populations. So now we're seeing the Uyghurs in Western China and Xinjiang and Turks, as Ethan Gutman pointed out in his book from a couple of months ago. That was just, I think it was just published in March of this year. We're seeing house Christians. And so I think what happens is if the medical system doesn't take a stance, if the population at large doesn't take a stance, you have an erosion of all of ethics. So to me, this is, to Torsten's point, this is a very specific problem. This is the Chinese Communist Party and Jiang Zemin specifically seeing an opportunity when you flooded its prisons with hundreds of thousands of young, probably more women than men, but very young, very healthy practitioners of Falun Gong. And because they haven't, I think, garnered the sympathy and the understanding that they deserve, I think we're seeing this happen to other populations within China to this date.
Hi, I'm an ophthalmologist from Los Angeles, and I want to congratulate you for this. I think what you've done is heroic. The first thing I thought about was, I don't know if anybody has read Walter Isaacson's books. One of them is CRISPR about Jennifer Doudna. And they talk about the unethical practice of medicine in China with, I think his last name is Jiankui, with gene editing. But this by far goes beyond what that ever says. You talked about, cutting skin and getting sick. I've done transplants, and listening to this, I was sick to my stomach. And I want to congratulate you. And one thing I would urge you to do, if there's I understand that you cannot cut this, but if there's a shorter version, I think you have to apply as one of the candidates for Academy Awards for short movies. I think this will be up there and far beyond anything that I've seen presented. I think you will qualify easily.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you. One thing that struck me is I hadn't seen this final version, and I was sitting in the back, and when you showed the 3 victims of Falun Gong that one had been harvested that looked like his organs, I reeled. I noticed and I've seen those pictures before, and I closed my eyes. I mean, I noticed people in the audience kind of reeling back from it, and I think that's the horror that I think strikes at most of us when you first hear about forced organ harvesting.
Hello. My question is, obviously, I'm going to ask about the big news. So obviously, the China meeting just happened, and a number of things were discussed, as we know, economic realities. Taiwan was discussed, but we haven't heard anything about human rights or this issue specifically. So what would you say you think you can do to bring the issue more public and on the minds of American policymakers, given that American policymakers are concerned about other things with China and aren't focusing as much on this? Thank you.
Well, I think, just from my perspective, the whole point of this film is to spread the word and build sort of a public outcry, because that's what our politicians, we have to grassroots style force them to respond to us. So a film like this, a sort of campaign behind it to spread the word, I think a shorter version is a really good idea. And the other thing is clips, social media, put this out in every possible way to spread the word, so that puts pressure on the politicians. The politicians put pressure on China, that that seems to be the way forward. So what we're doing here is very important, and what you're doing here is very important in garnering that kind of energy and momentum.
I think you bring up an important issue, which is since the Clinton administration, and probably even just before that, we have tried to decouple human rights from economics. And the thought, I think, was well-intentioned, which is to, this, just to be clear, this isn't my area of expertise, but the intention, I think it was well-intentioned, like the medical community, the well-intentioned idea of if we interact with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese transplant system, we will influence their lack of ethical standards or ethical principles with our good ethical principles. And I've been thinking about this the last few days. I think it's sort of like having a bad apple, which is the Chinese Communist Party, an evil system that goes after its own good people, and thinking that, well, if you have a bunch of good apples and a bad apple, it will turn the bad apple good. But what you indeed see is the opposite. And so I think the human rights issue, I think Brownback had said that this sort of seems like a niche issue that's not taken as seriously as I think it was with the Soviet Union during, especially the Reagan administration. The Chinese Communist Party was allowed into the World Trade Organization in December of 2001. And so I think we've legitimized them in some ways. I think this brings up a comment somebody else made about the WHO. I think we've legitimized them, and they have corrupted a lot of our major institutions that should be standing to protect the world, to protect innocent lives wherever they are globally.
And I would add to this what has been said, that this is a big mistake, that human rights are always isolated or put into quarantine. It happened with China for decades. When it comes to human rights, China always gets a buy. We fight for human rights in other countries, but when it comes to China, we don't even address it. And this is on purpose. I believe that in the planning of these meetings, mostly about economy, I think there's this agreement that human rights issues are not being addressed, and that's a huge problem. Why? Human rights reflect the mind of the country or the government that we are dealing with. If we are not aligned in human rights, if we are not aligned in values, what do you expect from the business and economy and the economic exchange with this country? There will be cheating, there will be hacking into our computers, there will be counterfeits, there will be copying of ideas, anything that is not ethical. And why? Because the human rights also don't follow ethics. So what you find in human rights tells you right away who's your business partner. If you're not aligned on human rights, don't complain if you later lose money or if your products are copied. So it is, I believe it's a huge mistake from governments when they address China that they bypass human rights. It should be actually at the knock at the door. You should come in and say, let's talk about human rights first, and then about contracts.
Yes. Yeah. I work with Holocaust survivors in Israel, and also worked with abortion survivors and to stop abortion. And then what you're dealing with, to me, is just another Holocaust at a greater, how I would say, more advanced ability, because We are having a Holocaust with babies. They're birthing them. They're taking their organs. They're placing them. They're making, experiments at them. Exactly what they did with the Holocaust survivors, which are exactly what they're doing with your people. And it all comes down to, this is really a demonic thing that we're dealing with. It's a spiritual thing besides a physical thing. The only thing that's going to work in China is for Trump to say your money's cut off until this thing's handled. That's really, I've seen him do it on a couple of other things. China came over to negotiate in his first time. He offered him something. They wouldn't take it. He left the room. They came back, wanted that. He said, that was what I offered before. Forget it. And I think some of his tariffs and stuff that he did the last time almost crippled them ridiculously. If I understand right, if anybody can correct me that's more knowledgeable in that area, but I thought they got really bad. And so I'm telling you, I think we have the power in our politics. And as you said, I do know Brownback. He went and changed a lot of, with the last time with Trump, where they changed it and opened up churches and did a lot of things in other countries and faith and stuff, and that were being persecuted. So I know that we can do it, but I do believe that this is excellent. But if you want to have a mass I've learned in TV, since I have a TV show, 20 minutes is the #1 watched length. So do it in 2 parts. 20 and 20, but do something where they get hooked, because I believe that this could be massive, people signing on to it. And then also they have a thing that you can put on where people will sign and say that I'm against this. You'd be surprised how many people would sign up on that, and that brings leverage in Washington.
How about 60 minutes?
In 60 minutes, yeah, and you can, different shows and everything you'll be on. But I just think that I want to tell you, after working with the Holocaust survivors, I've never cried so much in my whole life over stuff that was done. And I've seen stuff that's happened. So I just think that this is such a big Holocaust issue, and it's not the only country doing this. And but I think it can be the leading country, because if we deal with the big guy, I think it will funnel through other countries.
I wonder how these desperate patients find who to see in China. I mean, they must have some source. Is it the doctors or who?
I mean, just a couple comments. This is something that Chris Smith, one of the representatives, I think, from New Jersey, he's spoken out against forced organ harvesting for decades, and has really brought light to the horrific things that the Chinese Communist Party has done. But his bill, Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Bill, which is another Senate bill, really goes after the brokers. So there are brokers out there that are doing this. I think one of the hard things is knowing how do in 2005, if you had a laptop and you could go on the internet, you would find, I think what I mentioned in the film, you would find these websites that were Chinese hospitals, Chinese transplant centers, that were advertising, come to China, pay this amount of dollars. You saw it in that Korean film as well. So there are brokers out there. That's what we saw in that film. That was a particular wing for the Korean population to come for organ tourism that was aimed at the Koreans to essentially profit, and then you have to assume if somebody's getting a kidney in 1 or 2 days. I think that was in 2016 when that was filmed. But if somebody's getting a kidney in 1 or 2 days, somebody's being murdered for that kidney.
I think there are different ways to connect to patients in need. One are the advertisements on the internet. You can do research, and then hospitals from China advertise on the internet and offer transplants. And then we also know as a fact that some leading doctors in the transplant field, they were actually telling their patients, if you really need an organ, you can go to China. I can help you to find a contact. They meet, the transplant surgeons meet in conferences. They exchange business cards, and then the Chinese counterpart said, if you need a fast transplant, we can help. So there's this connection where doctors recommend to their patients to go to China. Another aspect is, which we found out from one of our doctors in Italy. She was working in a dialysis center, that patients who received, for example, a kidney, they are waiting in the dialysis center with other patients in the waiting room. And they were told if they recruit another patient for a kidney transplant, they get 10% discount or paid for recruiting a new patient. So there are many ways how this is working, and public awareness, like really spreading the word, making this go viral, and say, if you go to China, you are most likely become complicit in the assassination of a prisoner to get an organ. So it really has to come to this awareness that patients who travel from abroad to China, they become complicit in this crime.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you all for your tremendous courage and efforts, and the Epoch Times in messaging the world. It's just tremendous what you all have done with your gifts, that you've maybe God-given gifts and acquired gifts. I was wondering if you could speak, please, towards the medical personnel in China that's being coerced and threatened in performing some of these procedures, as well as the other folks involved, whether it be orderlies or anesthetists or whatever. Recently, the Epoch Times had run a message, an article about one person in particular, how his family had been threatened. He was a physician, and he was plagued with the moral conflict. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, and if you could perhaps address it.
This is a good question, and this is a very difficult question to answer, because we in the West do not understand the society of a communist country. Here in the West, many doctors, transplant doctors specifically, they welcome doctors from China, and they train them, and they say, well, we also teach them in ethics. We want to stop the practice by teaching them about ethics. That's a good intention. However, if that doctor goes back to China and lives in that peer group of doctors who have to abide by the communist rule, they have two choices. If they bring in the ethics, the ethical discussion to the hospital, they might go to prison after a week, because because they live in the whole society where only the communist rule, the rule of the CCP, is ruling, and what the CCP says is the rule. So there is no concept of ethical standards or international standards. In fact, the Chinese leadership is laughing about the Western concept of ethics. So the reality is, if these doctors come back to China, within days they forget everything or suppress everything related to ethics. They just say, I have to survive, I have to live. My colleagues, they take organs from prisoners and from prisoners of conscience, so I have to do the same. So it's this is the doctors in China are kind of in a gray zone where they might want to follow ethics, but they don't have the environment to do so.
I'll make one comment. There was the World Organization to Investigate the Persecution of Falun Gong, which apparently in Chinese is a much shorter name, so it's a mouthful. They interviewed a police officer, I think it was in 2009, who was in the operating room, and it's the only window I've seen into what happens in an operating room. And my guess is it's changed over time. But I think he was in the operating room of a young woman in her 30s who was a Falun Gong practitioner who had been raped for weeks. She was held down. She was still awake. She was screaming, Falun Dafa Hao, which means Falun Dafa is good. And there were security and police officers in the room, and the surgeon was going to cut the chest. This was the testimony that he gave. And the surgeon, almost like the skin that you reeled from, sort of stopped because she was just there screaming, and then proceeded to carve out her organs. My understanding is there's a procurement team, and when you have dehumanized a group so badly, and not just dehumanize them, you've demonized them. I mean, you'll hear Chinese talk about their seething hatred for Falun Gong, just like you heard seething hatred for the Jews during the Holocaust. That's irrational and unfounded. And I think when you have that group that has been so demonized and dehumanized, a surgeon will probably just tell himself, this is somebody that was going to die anyways, which is not true. These are not people that have been condemned to death. And even within the Chinese legal code, if you look at Article 35 and Article 36, Falun Gong are actually protected under Chinese code itself. So all of this has happened extrajudiciously within China. You guys may have heard the 610 office. That was an office that is essentially the Chinese Communist Party's Gestapo. It was formed on June 10th of 1999, thus 610. And the 610 office basically operates to propagandize, to detain, to terrify, to carry out violence against Falun Gong practitioners. So that's the window that I see in these operating rooms. And again, as I mentioned earlier, now it's probably happening to house Christians, to Uyghurs or Muslims in Xinjiang and Turkics in Xinjiang in Western China. But that's the only clue I've had into what's happening. And I don't know if that's the case every time. Now, Ethan Gutman mentions that they're using ECMO or they're using other ways that they feel more comfortable fully anesthetizing the patient, but I think they were not fully anesthetizing Falun Gong, if at all, when they were essentially what Chris Smith calls using murder masquerading as medicine.
Yeah, if I may first, thank you for presenting just a shocking and motivating movie. Quick comment on ethics. It seems to me that getting into the medical schools and when they teach the Hippocratic Oath, getting this kind of thing featured so medical students early on understand. But the big comment I have is the why. The why is this happening? It's not just money. And I think, even that it's a persecuted group. Why are they doing this? And my understanding is that the following of Falun Gong rivals at 100 million the membership of the Communist Party. And they see it as a threat. The number one sort of following that could rival them, and that the Communist Party doesn't want religion of any kind. They want to be the religion. And this sort of autocratic, basic, why is this happening, I think is part of the story that needs to get out, along with how innocent Falun Gong followers are, how they are peaceful, how it is not a cult, it is a way of living, healthy living, meditation, prayer. But I think that why, that connection with why the CCP is doing this would be one additional thing to emphasize.
Well, thank you for this question, because you bring exactly up the point that this film wants to make. It wants to reveal forced organ harvesting. It wants to show forced organ harvesting exists, and etc. And then it leaves the audience with this question: why? And this is the starting point where people start to think independently why this is happening. that would be subject to another film. Why? Initially, there was a provision from 1984 that permitted the government to take organs from executed prisoners. So it was some kind of practice. Actually, convicted prisoners were the only source of organs for many years. Then in 1999, the persecution of Falun Gong started. And that is actually crucial to understand the why. Why were they persecuted? Not only because there were 100 million people who practiced this, whereas the CCP only had like 60 million members. That's one part. But maybe it was also the jealousy of the leader at that time of the CCP that Falun Gong was actually more popular than the CCP. But there's another issue to it. The CCP has a certain characteristic. It lives on lies. It lives on brutality, and it lives on a one-party state. So everything that the Communist Party embodies are the opposite of what Falun Gong stands for. Falun Gong pursues truthfulness. But you know that if you do a search on Google in China, you will not find any comment about a massacre on Tiananmen Square. This has been censored. Censorship is crucial in that one-party state. They have to control the narrative. They have to control the truth. The truth is always in favor of the CCP. Then you have compassion that is part of the Falun Gong practice. This compassion is completely opposite to the brutality that the totalitarian government follows. If you look at the Tiananmen Square massacre, where they shot 3,000 students in one night, you have all the answers. So, and then part of the Falun Gong practice is tolerance or forbearance. Tolerance requires that there's a second opinion. Without having more than two opinions, there's no room for tolerance. If there's only one opinion, like you have with the CCP, tolerance there's no place for tolerating anything else than the CCP. So you have a natural opposition of the Falun Gong characteristic and the CCP characteristic. And this was not intended, but the CCP feels threatened, feels threatened because the good principles from Falun Gong would actually reflect the evilness, the demon behind the CCP. So they rather destroy the mirror to not let anyone understand about the evil character of the CCP. And that gives you the why. They have to silence Falun Gong. They have to not only detain Falun Gong practitioners, but if you understand it as a final solution, if you kill Falun Gong practitioners through the process of forced organ harvesting, that ensures the total silence that you want. Because if they are not alive, they cannot testify to their practice. So that gives you the why. The CCP wants to eradicate, demonize, and frame it in a negative way, outcast it, so that they can exist. And by having a common sense and having a sense of good values, of ethics, etc., then you will not only understand that Falun Gong is a good practice, but also that the CCP is an evil practice, and I would almost say a poison to the world.
I just want to make one comment that was of interest to me when you said that, because I remember about 10 years ago, I was here for a meeting and driving into DC and seeing the Holocaust Museum, and what I remember is there was a big banner that said, never stop asking why.
Yeah, very good.
If I may, the murder of the Falun Gong, the final solution, in addition to that, the silencing effect that has, the quieting effect, the chilling effect that it has on the rest of the Falun Gong to stay silent, to to not practice openly, to just that fear, that message of fear, I think is a big part of it, seems like, too.
We have maybe time for one, maybe maximum two more questions.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I want to tell you all thank you for your sacrifice and dedication to doing this, and basically for fighting the good fight in this issue. But I guess from a problem-solving viewpoint, you know, I was trained academically, or brainwashed academically, if you will, to basically, you know, brainstorm, and no idea is a bad idea, and until you start sifting down these different ideas. So the film is excellent, but one example that we had been involved in sponsoring the Unplanned movie, and boom, right up front, they had an abortion on the screen, and of course some people walked out because they couldn't handle it. And that's the kind of thing that I think, if you really want to impact people, that's the horror that you should not be able to get out of your mind, that motivates you to get involved and do something. So what I would suggest about what you guys have done, I would assume that you have a lot more pictures, if you will, of the actual victims of this, you know, modern day Holocaust, if you would. And to me, you need more punch, with like a shock and awe of the horror, that basically it doesn't leave your mind, which it motivates you to basically get involved, especially from a political standpoint. Because even like in talking with our U.S. House member from our state, he said that the House of Representatives had a specific viewing that was only for, you know, I guess that particular group of people, so to speak, that the public never sees. And so basically, he come out of that like it just floors you that man can be that evil. And so that's what I think. This evil has to be just blow people away. I mean, all the testimonies and all the academics and all that is great, but I would suggest that we need more horror pictures, if you will, in order that people don't forget.
Yeah, I just want to quickly address this. There are other documentaries and films about this topic. We have approached this topic as a medical organization, and we wanted to speak with medical doctors and wanted to speak to medical doctors. In this field, if we choose a sensational approach, we are not really staying on the ground that is so crucial to the medical profession. So we chose intentionally to stay a little bit on the conservative side, on the informational side, and to stay away from the too sensational side. There's more to say, but we want to choose this rational approach. In terms of photos, it is actually difficult because in China the victims of forced organ harvesting are incinerated. This is part of the scheme to avoid any piece of evidence go out, because as you can imagine, if this would become public knowledge, if this would become a part of the international foreign policy dealing with China, then this would be an earthquake to China. I think we are clear if forced organ harvesting is being discussed, if it goes viral and discussed all over the world, then we have the situation that we had previously in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square massacre, where all countries withdrew business from China, and then China will change. So there are limitations we had to deal with, and also choices that we made to stay on the ground. Maybe one more question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jason Jones. I'm a filmmaker, and I run a human rights organization, the Vulnerable People Project. It's a Catholic organization. And I think it's a testimony to your film. I go to a lot of film festivals, and there's a lot of Q&A. I've never seen everyone ask a question and have a comment. So I think that's the power of your film. I want to make an offer and then a question. We just mailed Yanya Kellick's book, Killed to Order, to every bishop in the United States, Catholic bishop, 440 bishops, imploring them to advocate to Pope Leo to break the secret CCP deal with China, listing organ harvesting as a key reason why we should not renew that deal. I thought it was spitting in the wind. I was shocked at how many bishops have written back with concern, wanting to know more. So I'd like to offer, if it's okay, and I don't know your distribution strategy, if we can, in our response to the bishops, host screenings in the dioceses that are eager. We would love to do that. We're actually going to be mailing Jan's book. Yeah. This is going to be fun. We're going to be mailing Jan's book in the coming weeks to every bishop in Asia and Europe, including China, with the same letter imploring them to break the deal. And my other suggestion is, in August of 2027, it's the Ames, Iowa straw poll. You have to be in the top 3 in the GOP in that straw poll to really go forward in fundraising. It's a very easy thing to manipulate. I've worked on it like 6 cycles. Another thing I would like to offer is if this August in Ames, Iowa, we host a screening and we invite all the GOP political types, because not just for the primary, but of the folks probably running for president, include a Secretary of State, a Vice President, and the Director of National Intelligence. So if we can put this on the radar of their potential surrogates, I think we can really influence this administration and make this a non-negotiable issue for GOP voters in the primary. And then so that's an offer we'd like to do. My question is, I've been in every major war zone in the past 30 years. It's hard, but it's manageable. The hardest things I've had to deal with is the moral injury from documenting crimes from a distance where one feels helpless and has no skin in the game. So you've committed your lives to this. So my question is twofold. One is, how do you, as activists, handle the moral injury of this? And then maybe, Torsten, I don't know if the rest of you are Fallen Dauphin practitioners, but as a Catholic, I understand how our theology informs how we handle persecution and suffering. Fallen Dauphin practitioners they handle suffering with such dignity. What is it in your philosophy and worldview that allows you to do that? Those who suffer persecution directly, and those of you who communicate it to the world and witness it from a distance. Thank you.
So the question is how to deal with this situation. And as you know, this is a gut-wrenching topic. And if you think about this every day, you were not able to handle this for 20 years. So one aspect is that I have a lot of humor, and the humor always helps me to recover quickly. And I don't omit any situation where I cannot find a little bit humor, because that is almost like a medicine to the heart. Actually, Mark Twain said humor is the umbrella of wise people, if you want. The other thing is that I don't stay too much in the moment. I always look forward. I always go forward to the next project. What can we do next? How can we? Which channel do we do next? What projects do we check? Do we aim for next? Next time going forward. So by going forward, by choosing the next project as quick as possible, you're actually not so much in the past. If you stay in the past, that's where the emotion drags you down. And it happened. It's gruesome. Don't think too much. What can you do? Go forward. Go into action. Go find find the next opportunity to talk to somebody. That is kind of the engine that helps to run for 20 years. At this point, we are closing the Q&A. We are on we have a live stream, and we have to follow the time limits that we have. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for showing your reaction. This is extremely motivating. Thank you.
Thank you so much.